In front of the Zambian presidential palace, hundreds of people raised placards and chanted for justice, demanding fairness for African citizens who had paid visa fees only to be rejected without explanation or refund. Among them were students denied the chance to study abroad, entrepreneurs blocked from attending international summits, and families kept apart by a cold, bureaucratic process. But this protest was not directed at Zambia's government. It was a loud show of support for its leader's unprecedented diplomatic stance. That leader, President Hakainde Hichilema of Zambia, had just issued a bold demand to Europe and the United Kingdom refund the billions of dollars collected from African citizens in visa fees for applications that were ultimately rejected. These were legitimate, fully paid applications, but instead of travel, applicants received short, emotionless rejection letters. No explanation, no appeals, no refund. This was not merely a complaint about immigration policy. It was a strike at the heart of a system that for decades operated under a false sense of normalcy. A system where millions of Africans paid not to travel, but to be denied. And on the other side of that system were governments profiting in silence. But this story is far bigger than Zambia. It speaks to a continental reality where people are judged not by the content of their application, but by the color of their passport, the GDP of their country, and a default assumption that they might not return home. Meanwhile, European citizens enjoy visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to much of Africa, including Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and even Zambia itself. This brings us to a critical question. If visas are merely a tool of border control, why are they so profitable? If they're just paperwork, why are the fees non-refundable? And if the system is truly fair, why are the poorest countries the ones with the highest rejection rates? Starting with what seemed like a small demand, a refund. This video reveals a much larger truth, a global system designed not to welcome but to exclude, not to protect borders but to extract value, a system that upholds a global order where African travelers are last in line, always paying, rarely allowed in. By design, the visa system was supposed to be a security tool, a gate through which travelers are assessed for eligibility to enter another country. But over time, that gate has transformed into a revenue engine, not profiting from illegal migration, but from ordinary citizens who follow the rules. Those who submit complete applications respect deadlines, and most importantly, pay the full fee. In 2024 alone, statistics revealed that African citizens lost over 67.5 million due to rejected Schengen visa applications. The United Kingdom collected another $50 million from applicants across Africa whose visas were ultimately denied. In total, more than $120 million was extracted from Africans, not to enable travel, but simply to say no. Here's the catch: these fees are non-refundable. Whether the application is accepted or not, the fee is gone. Even if the applicant never boards a plane or steps foot outside their country, the payment is final. The reason: processing fees. But what exactly is being processed? Who is held accountable for errors? Why do rejection letters almost always end with the same cold sentence? There is no right of appeal. Imagine if a fast food chain charged customers for meals they never served. There would be outrage and lawsuits. If a university accepted tuition payments but rejected students without reason, it would spark a public outcry. Yet in the visa world, millions are collected without delivering any product or service, and somehow that's considered normal. Worse still, this isn't accidental. It's a system, a business model built on rejection, where denials aren't failures of the system but rather integral to its profitability. Every visa refusal is not just a bureaucratic decision, it's a transaction completed. The buyer paid, the seller kept the money, and no product was delivered. Visa applications have become conditional purchases. You pay in full up front, and if you're denied, you lose everything. And who loses the most? Not because of poor documentation or incomplete forms, but simply because they come from Africa. This system quietly generates consistent revenue, year after year. It doesn't need to improve its services. it doesn't answer to customer complaints. And most critically, it bears no accountability. In this model, the more rejections issued, the more profit is made. Behind the seemingly simple statistics on visa rejections lies a deeply systemic injustice. The rejection rates for African applicants are not just high, they are consistently abnormally high, and have remained so for years. While countries like the United States and Japan see Schengen visa rejection rates below 10%. African nations such as Nigeria, Ghana, and Guinea-Bissau report rates exceeding 47%, even surpassing 50% in some cases. These discrepancies persist despite applicants submitting the same forms, paying the same fees, and applying for the same purposes, visiting family, attending conferences, or tourism. The difference is not in the application but in the passport. A university graduate with a formal invitation, a clear itinerary, and complete documents can still be denied, simply because their passport comes from a so-called high-risk country. The injustice becomes even clearer when you look at the vague reasons given for these denials: insufficient ties to home country, risk of overstaying, unclear travel intent. These are broad, subjective justifications not grounded in transparent criteria, and they come with no right to appeal. Visa officers are under no obligation to provide detailed explanations, leaving applicants in a position where they are judged, but have no way to respond or defend themselves. Take, for example, a Zambian businesswoman who submitted financial statements, an official invitation from a European partner, a return ticket, and confirmed hotel reservations only to be denied. Or a Nigerian engineer invited to a tech conference in Paris, rejected without specific reason. Or a Kenyan artist scheduled to perform in Germany, denied just days before departure. These are not isolated incidents, they have become the norm for African applicants. And the most dangerous part is, no one is held accountable. The visa system operates with unchecked administrative power, no oversight, no transparency, no public scrutiny. In this environment, bias becomes institutionalized. It is sanitized through forms hidden in bureaucratic language and enforced through impersonal rejection letters. This silence, this lack of accountability, is what allows nationality-based discrimination to flourish under the guise of procedure. What was once viewed as bad luck is now being understood as systematic exclusion, a quiet but calculated process that reinforces inequality, one that tells African citizens you are not welcome and you don't even deserve an explanation. Zambia's demand for visa fee refunds is not merely a financial claim, it is a strategic warning. If Western nations continue treating African citizens unfairly, Africa will reconsider how it treats them in return. For the first time in decades, an African head of state has publicly challenged the legitimacy of the global visa regime, signaling a potential rewrite of the rules governing diplomacy, commerce, and mobility. Historically, African countries have often conceded to Western pressure motivated by the need for investment aid and development cooperation. But that context is changing. Africa today is no longer the vulnerable continent of the 1990s. It is a rising region with a young population, a growing consumer base, abundant strategic resources, and enormous economic potential. Most importantly, Africa is beginning to realize that it holds real leverage. Look no further than natural resources, a sector Europe cannot afford to ignore. The Democratic Republic of Congo supplies more than 70% of the world's cobalt, a critical material for producing batteries, electric vehicles, and renewable energy systems. Guinea has the world's largest reserves of bauxite, the main source of aluminum. Zimbabwe is rich in lithium, Ghana in gold, and South Africa in platinum and rare earth elements. Without these materials, Europe's green energy transition is impossible. Beyond resources, Europe also relies on Africa for migration control, military outposts, key trade routes, and geopolitical influence at the United Nations. For years, African nations have willingly offered visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to Western nationals, motivated by the hope that goodwill would be reciprocated. But that never happened. Instead of respect, Africa received cold rejection letters, suspicion, and humiliating administrative hurdles. The dream that openness would lead to fairness is now fading. In its place, a new philosophy is taking shape. Respect must be reciprocal. Zambia is not alone. In 2024, Nigeria temporarily suspended visa on arrival for several European countries, citing imbalanced diplomatic conduct. Senegal blocked a European trade delegation after business leaders were denied visas. Kenya initiated talks to revise visa policies based on how its citizens are treated abroad. These may not be permanent measures, but they mark the beginning of a continental pushback. Experts within the African Union have floated proposals such as charging non-refundable visa fees for European citizens, mirroring current Western practices, imposing visa quotas on nationals from countries with high African rejection rates, limiting diplomatic privileges for embassies that perpetuate discriminatory treatment. Crucially, these ideas are no longer dismissed as radical. They are seen as necessary to restore balance. As Africa realizes it controls access to essential resources, its bargaining power increases not just in immigration, but in trade diplomacy and strategic influence. How has the West responded so far with silence? But if this movement for visa fairness spreads and becomes a continent-wide policy shift, the impact will be clear. European tourism will suffer if Africa becomes less accessible. Resource companies will face tougher investment terms. Diplomatic outreach will be hindered as African nations adopt conditional access policies. The game is changing, not because Africa is being aggressive, but because it's no longer willing to be passive. And this is the essence of geopolitical leverage. Respect is not requested, it is demanded through conditions. Africa is no longer content with symbolic gestures. It is beginning to act with purpose, coordination, and confidence. And the global visa conversation, once controlled entirely by the West, may soon have new rules written in Africa. For decades, international travel has been framed as a matter of privileged security or regulation, something granted, not owed. But in today's hyper-connected, globally interdependent world, the ability to move freely is more than a convenience. It is a form of power. It determines who gets to speak at global conferences, who attends international summits, who secures cross-border investments, and who can escape crisis or conflict. Mobility is not a luxury, it is a gateway to opportunity. And yet, for millions of Africans, this gateway is locked. Not because of poor preparation, criminal history, or lack of purpose, but because of where they were born. Their passports are marked not by ink, but by assumptions. They are seen not as students, entrepreneurs, or diplomats, but as potential overstayers, economic threats, or liabilities. This silent discrimination is built into the design of global visa systems. But now that silence is being shattered, Africa is beginning to challenge the world's assumption that it must prove its worth to be allowed access. The continent is saying, we are not asking to be let in, we are asking for fairness. And this shift in narrative is profoundly political. Let's start with the fundamental imbalance. European and UK citizens enjoy widespread access across Africa, often without needing a visa at all. Zambia allows them to stay up to 90 days visa-free. Kenya offers visas on arrival. Ghana, Rwanda, Botswana, and others have eased or eliminated entry requirements altogether. These policies were designed to promote tourism, encourage trade, and signal openness. And Africa delivered. Tourists came, deals were signed. Western investors, celebrities, and diplomats walked through African airports without queues or scrutiny. They were welcomed with open arms and red carpets. What did Africa get in return? Closed doors, cold silence, bureaucratic suspicion, while European citizens breeze through African airports with a smile. African citizens face an obstacle course to go the other way. Bank statements proving solvency, employment verification letters, travel insurance and return flight tickets, proof of accommodation, invitation letters with detailed itineraries, biometric data and in-person interviews. And after submitting all of this, most applicants are still rejected. This isn't just a hassle, it's humiliation. And it sends a clear message: you are not trusted. So what does Africa do now? This is where the narrative begins to shift. Africa is starting to view mobility not as a gift from the West, but as a right that must be mutual. If African nations are generous with access, they expect reciprocity. If that is not given, they are ready to act. And this shift is not just happening at the political level, it is cultural, it is generational. Young Africans, the most connected, educated, and global-minded generation in the continent's history, are waking up to a painful truth. They are being systematically excluded from the world they are most ready to engage with. They see their friends in Europe taking weekend trips across borders with a single ID. Meanwhile, their own applications are denied despite months of preparation. The psychological toll is immense. It breeds frustration, mistrust, and resentment. It tells young Africans that their dreams are conditional, that their identity is a burden. And that is perhaps the greatest cost of all, not just lost money, not just missed flights, but lost confidence. So what happens now? Africa has begun to speak clearly. Mobility must be mutual. If Western nations continue to use visa systems as filters for wealth and power, then Africa has every right to reassess its own policies. Reciprocity is not revenge, it is balance. And the proposals on the table are gaining traction. Reciprocal visa fees. If African citizens must pay non-refundable fees, so should European travelers. Visa quotas. Countries that systematically reject African applicants may face restrictions of their own. Reevaluation of diplomatic privileges. Embassies that do not treat African citizens with fairness may find their own access challenged. These are not threats. These are signals. Signals that Africa is no longer playing by the old rules. The world must recognize a new reality. Africa is not peripheral, it is pivotal. With key minerals, a booming population, and growing political leverage, the continent is central to the global future. Its people must be treated as equals, not risks. Because the longer these barriers remain, the more Africa will pull away, not out of anger, but out of necessity. We are witnessing the beginning of a mobility revolution, one where access is no longer dictated by wealth alone, but by respect. One where fairness replaces privilege. One where the right to move is no longer granted by legacy empires, but negotiated between equals. Zambia's call for refunds was not just about money, it was a declaration, a signal to every African leader, policymaker, and citizen. You have leverage, use it. The next chapter of global mobility will not be written in European consulates, it will be written in African capitals, and this time it will be mutual. As an African, this story is more than a political headline, it is a personal reckoning. I have lived it. Many of us have. We've stood in line outside embassies at dawn, files in hand, hoping that this time the outcome will be different, that this time our application will be seen as more than a risk, that we'll be viewed as travelers, professionals, students, not threats. But more often than not, we walk away with the same thing: rejection, without explanation. When I heard that President Hakainde Hichilema of Zambia publicly demanded a refund for rejected visa applicants, something stirred inside me. It wasn't just admiration, it was vindication. Finally, a leader dared to say what we've all been feeling, that our dignity has a price, and the world has been collecting that price, without delivering anything in return. You see, for decades, the visa process has been a quiet humiliation that we learned to internalize. We told ourselves, maybe I didn't provide enough documents, or maybe next time. But deep down, we knew the truth. It's not the documents. It's the passport. It's where we come from. This system, one that extracts hundreds of millions from Africans for the privilege of being denied, is not only unfair, it is morally bankrupt. And what makes it more painful is the silence, the indifference. The way our rejection letters arrive with robotic coldness, stating there is no right of appeal, as if our aspirations never mattered in the first place. President Hichilema's move was powerful, not because of its financial implications, but because of what it symbolized. For the first time in my memory, an African president spoke directly to the imbalance, the hypocrisy and the quiet exploitation that we have endured for too long. He didn't ask for a favor, he demanded justice. And in doing so, he gave a voice to millions who never had one in the rooms where these policies were designed. There's something profoundly unjust about how the world views African travelers. We are asked to prove things that others never need to show savings return tickets, hotel bookings, invitation letters, and more, only to be told no without cause. It is exhausting, emotionally draining, and ultimately degrading. And yet the world continues to profit from it. What kind of system turns rejection into a business model? How is it ethical to collect millions in processing fees while offering no accountability? When restaurants fail to deliver food, customers get refunds. When airlines cancel flights, passengers are compensated. But in the world of visas, the rules are different. There is no fairness, only silence and profit. That is why this story matters. Because for once, the silence was broken. The story also sparked a deeper realization: Africa has power. Real power. We are no longer the passive continent waiting for aid and permission. We are the source of critical minerals. We are the hosts of strategic ports. We are the future market for global growth. And if access to Africa has always been easy for Europeans, it's time that access to their world be equally fair. As young Africans, we are often told to dream big, to connect globally, to innovate. But how can we do that when the gates are locked before we even begin? When we spend months preparing only to be rejected without reason? The message becomes clear: our dreams are conditional. And that leaves a scar, one that no refund can erase. I've seen friends give up on international opportunities not because they lacked talent or ambition, but because they couldn't navigate the bureaucracy and bias of the visa system. I've seen entrepreneurs miss out on global conferences, artists denied the chance to perform, families separated, and for what? To uphold an outdated view of African mobility as dangerous or undesirable. The visa issue is not just about movement, it is about identity. It tells us how the world sees us. And right now, it is saying you are not welcome unless you're rich, connected, or from the right country. That is the very definition of structural discrimination. And yet, despite all this, African nations have continued to welcome others with open arms. No fingerprinting at entry, no exhaustive documentation, often not even a visa requirement. We did this not out of weakness, but out of hope that openness would be met with respect. But that hope is fading. I support the calls for reciprocal visa policies, not as revenge, but as fairness. If our citizens must pay non-refundable fees, so should theirs. If our professionals are denied entry for vague reasons, we should demand the same transparency from their embassies. This isn't about closing doors. It's about making sure they open both ways. The West cannot expect African cooperation in trade, migration control, or diplomacy while treating our people as second-class citizens at their borders. Those days are gone. Africa is waking up, and our leaders are beginning to reflect the dignity we've always deserved. This story, this moment, may well mark a turning point. It shows that Africa is no longer asking politely. We are stating our terms, not with hostility, but with clarity. And it is that clarity that frightens the status quo. We are not angry, we are not bitter, we are simply done waiting. Because at the heart of this issue is a simple principle: respect. We are not asking to be favored, we are demanding to be treated as equals. Our dreams, our talents, our families, they matter. And any system that profits from excluding us will eventually find itself isolated. President Hichilema's stand is a seed. I hope it grows into a movement across the continent, a movement that reclaims not just visa fees, but dignity, that refuses to accept rejection without reason, that demands the same respect we have extended to others. As Africans, we are proud, we are capable, and most importantly, we are ready. Let the world understand this clearly: mobility is not a Western privilege. It is a human right, and Africa will no longer be denied. This story is not merely about visas. It is about value, visibility, and voice. It is about how a simple demand for fairness from a Zambian president became a spark that illuminated decades of structural injustice. For too long, Africans have endured a silent system of exclusion, disguised as standard immigration policy. But now that silence is breaking, and with it comes an awakening. This story carries with it a multitude of lessons, both personal and political, that Africa must embrace moving forward. The first lesson is about recognition of systemic inequality. Many Africans, myself included, have long accepted visa rejection as a personal failing. We told ourselves that we lacked the right documentation, the right connections, or the right timing. We internalized the rejection. But the truth is, now undeniable, it's not about documents, it's about discrimination. When complete, verifiable applications are met with blanket refusals, and no right to appeal, it reveals a pattern too consistent to ignore. It is not an administrative issue, it is a structural injustice, and recognizing that is the first step toward transformation. Secondly, this situation teaches us the importance of leadership that listens and speaks. President Hakainde Hichilema did not just speak on behalf of Zambia. He gave voice to millions across Africa who have suffered in silence. In doing so, he reminded us that leadership is not about prestige, it is about courage. When a head of state publicly confronts global inequality, he redefines the role of African leadership in international diplomacy. Hichilema did not ask for sympathy, he demanded justice. And that changes everything. Third, we must examine the concept of reciprocity. For decades, Africa has welcomed the world with open arms, extending visa-free access, simplifying entry requirements, and providing hospitality without prejudice. In return, we have been met with suspicion, humiliation, and rejection. The lesson here is not that we must retaliate, but that fairness must be mutual. The principle of reciprocity is not about vengeance, it is about respect. If the West values cooperation with Africa in business, migration, and geopolitics, it must first honor the dignity of our citizens. The fourth lesson is economic. Visa rejections are not just administrative inconveniences, they are financial extractions. When over $120 million is taken from Africans each year in non-refundable application fees for visas that are almost guaranteed to be denied, we must call it what it is: exploitation. No business would be allowed to operate this way. No international law would tolerate such practices in trade. So why does it persist in travel? Because Africa has not yet fully leveraged its economic weight, but that is changing. Africa holds the keys to the global future. Strategic minerals, youthful populations, emerging markets. Our resources power the world's green energy transition. Our cooperation is critical in managing migration and trade flows. As we begin to realize our leverage, we must wield it wisely. The visa issue is not isolated. It is part of a broader power imbalance that touches every aspect of our international relationships. And now we are learning that dignity is part of the price of partnership. Another critical lesson is cultural. This story has awakened a generational consciousness. Young Africans are no longer content with polite rejection and passive endurance. They are questioning why their dreams are treated as threats, why their identities trigger suspicion. They are realizing that to build the Africa we want, we must first unlearn the inferiority that the world has projected onto us. This moment is not just political, it is psychological. It is a rejection of rejection itself. There is also a legal and moral lesson: fairness must be institutionalized. Visa systems today operate with no accountability. Embassies are allowed to deny entry without explanation, with no appeal, and with full retention of fees. This must change. African governments must push for transparency in the global visa regime, demanding data justifications and review mechanisms. Our people deserve better than silence. They deserve due process. Justice in mobility is just as vital as justice in trade aid or investment. Moreover, we must learn to speak as a bloc. Zambia's stance cannot be an isolated act of bravery. It must become a unified African voice. Whether through the African Union, regional alliances, or bilateral negotiations, the continent must adopt a coordinated strategy on mobility. Let the world know that access to Africa will be conditional on how Africa is treated abroad. When we speak together, we are not weak, we are unignorable. This narrative also teaches us that symbolism matters. The demand for visa refunds may not yield immediate results, but it symbolizes the end of passive acceptance. It shows that African frustration has reached a tipping point. And symbols have power they shape. Narratives inspire movements and drive policy change. This one action has already triggered conversations in Nigeria, Senegal, and Kenya. It has laid the foundation for a new mobility doctrine, rooted not in charity, but in equity. Finally, we must take responsibility for shaping our destiny. The old model of waiting for validation from the West must be abandoned. We must build our institutions, invest in our youth, and create opportunities within our borders. Let travel be a choice, not a necessity for survival. Let our people explore the world, not to escape Africa, but to represent it proudly. In conclusion, the visa injustice exposed in this story is a mirror held up to the global system, a system built on unequal rules, protected by silence and profiting from exclusion. But it is also a mirror for Africa itself, a chance to reflect on how we've accepted less than we deserve and how we can demand more. As an African, I walk away from this story not with bitterness, but with resolve. The resolve to fight for fairness, to challenge systems that diminish us, to uplift leaders who defend us, and to remind the world that African dignity is not a diplomatic afterthought. It is a non-negotiable condition for any meaningful partnership in the 21st century. Let this be our lesson. Let it be our turning point. Because Africa is rising, and this time we're not asking, we are asserting. What African voices teach us a lesson from the ground up. In the powerful echo of President Hichilema's bold statement, something even more profound surfaced: the voice of the people. Across online platforms, radio discussions, community circles, and international forums, African citizens, young and old, urban and rural professionals and students, began to speak not just with frustration, but with clarity, insight, and purpose. These comments, seemingly simple at first glance, offer some of the deepest lessons about dignity, justice, and the shifting winds of African consciousness. What follows are those lessons drawn from the ground up. Lesson 1. The pain was never just bureaucratic, it was emotional. One of the most repeated sentiments in the comments was not anger at lost money or missed flights. It was the quiet humiliation. Africans spoke of standing in long queues outside embassies with perfectly compiled files, only to receive a cold letter: your visa has been denied. There is no right to appeal. That sentence was repeated thousands of times across borders and generations, with no context, no compassion, no humanity. What it teaches us is this: bureaucracy without empathy becomes cruelty. The real pain wasn't rejection, it was being treated as unworthy of explanation. African citizens are not just asking to travel, they are asking to be seen. Lesson 2. This is not about privilege, it's about power. In dozens of comments, African youth drew a sharp contrast. European tourists walk into African airports, visa-free, smiling, taking pictures. But we need to prove our entire life to even get considered. This contrast reveals a deeper truth. Mobility is not neutral. It is geopolitical power. Who can move freely and who cannot determines who has influence in the global arena. African commenters are beginning to understand that visa policy is not just a travel issue. It's a gatekeeping mechanism of modern global hierarchy. And they are no longer satisfied with being at the bottom of that order. Lesson 3. The young generation is woke, global, and angry. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the public reaction was the emotional tone of African youth. This is a generation that grew up online, studied global trends, followed international debates, and dreamed of building bridges with the world. But they are now realizing that the world does not treat them as equals. "We did everything right," one comment read, "but we are treated like criminals before we even speak." The lesson here is urgent. The next generation of Africans is no longer naive. They are aware and they are hurt. If this anger festers unaddressed, it will not just be emotional, it will become political, economic, and strategic. Lesson 4. The rejection has a psychological toll. Beyond politics and economics, the comments reflected something even heavier: the emotional burden of constant rejection. Africans described how visa denials have left them questioning their self-worth. One user wrote, "It's hard to keep dreaming when every door you knock on is slammed in your face, not because of who you are, but because of where you're from." This points to a grave lesson: systemic exclusion breeds internalized inferiority, and that damages not only individual confidence, but also collective ambition. If Africa is to rise, it must first heal from this quiet psychological violence. Lesson 5. Reciprocity is no longer a threat, it's a demand. A recurring theme in the comments was a demand for reciprocal treatment. If Western nations deny Africans entry without refund or reason, why should Africans allow them visa-free access? Why should our doors be open to those who slam theirs in our face? This is not xenophobia, it's a demand for mutual respect. One comment said it clearly: "We are not asking for privilege, we are demanding parity." The lesson here is diplomatic. Africa is waking up to its bargaining power, and its citizens are urging leaders to use it. Lesson 6. Leadership matters. Silence is no longer acceptable. Many comments celebrated President Hichilema's courage, but also questioned why other African leaders remain silent. "Where is my president in this conversation?" one user asked. This reveals a new standard. Africans expect their leaders to stand up for their dignity on the world stage. No longer is silence acceptable. The message is clear: diplomacy must be backed by moral courage, not just negotiation tactics. The population is watching, and silence will be seen as complicity. Lesson 7. This is the beginning of a cultural shift. African citizens are no longer seeing visas as isolated administrative issues. They are tying the issue to broader questions of colonial legacy, post-colonial power structures, and global racism. One striking comment stated, "This isn't just a visa story, it's a story of how the world still sees Africa as inferior." That shift in perspective changes everything. The lesson here is cultural. We are moving from frustration to identity reclamation. Africans are reframing the narrative, not begging for access, but asserting equality. Lesson 8. Institutional discrimination cannot be hidden forever. Visa denials used to be quiet, personal events, but now they are going viral. Testimonies from business leaders, artists, students, and families are being shared widely online. Each story adds weight to a growing archive of injustice. One comment noted, "They can't hide behind procedure anymore. We have receipts." This shows the power of digital storytelling in exposing systemic injustice. The lesson is, tactical institutions built on silence are now vulnerable to exposure. And African citizens are learning how to use their voices and their platforms to hold the world accountable. Lesson 9. Dreams should not be gate-kept by passport color. The most heartbreaking comments came from those whose dreams were deferred. Young scholars, artists, tech innovators, and business professionals all stopped at the gate. "All I wanted was to attend a conference I was invited to. I even had the return ticket. Why am I a threat?" asked one comment. The lesson is clear: a passport should not be a prison. Denying someone the chance to connect, learn, and grow because of their nationality is not just discriminatory, it is wasteful. It robs the world of talent, connection, and progress. Lesson 10. Dignity is not negotiable. Above all, the comments taught us one thing: African dignity is no longer up for discussion. This isn't about demanding special treatment, it's about ending double standards. If they don't see our humanity, then we'll show them our strength, read one powerful comment. Africans are not waiting for the world to accept them. They are building leverage, confidence, and new narratives from within. And the lesson for the world is this: The age of passive Africa is over.